So I grew up in Central Texas. Now, in case you didn't know, Central Texas landscape is almost exactly like what you got right here. Except for mountains. Other than that, it's exactly the same. We have grass, we have trees. It's exactly the same. It's pretty much the same exact place. And where I grew up in a small town, actually, I lived 30 miles outside of a small town, and we had cows, and we had neighbors who also had cows, and I had a grandfather, like many people do. And so this is where my formative years were spent, in the hayfields with my grandfather. Every day at lunch, we'd get off the tractor, and we'd head over to the shade of one of the big loblolly pines, which provide absolutely no shade whatsoever, but we still tried it anyway. And we would sit under this tree, and my grandfather would unwrap the picnic lunch that my grandmother had made for us. And it never failed. It was the same thing every day. He would pull out the basket, he would pull out the food, and he'd hand it to me, and he'd say, "Brett, it's hot today." And it didn't matter when we were in the hayfield, because it's always hot in Central Texas. In fact, my 10-year-old son told me the other day, you know it's New Year's Eve when we have the air conditioner on low instead of high. And so he'd say, "Brett, it's hot today. I want you to remember today." Every day he would tell me, "Remember today. And I want you to do good in school, and I want you to go to college, and I don't want you to have to make your living sitting on a tractor." Now the funny thing is, I did just that. And all my family now makes fun of me for being a city boy. So what am I going to do? When I went off to the city, I met city folk. And I had heard about these city folk before. And they were just as strange as I had been told. Come to think of it, they weren't any stranger than the folks back home. They just had a different set of strangenesses. But we began to work through those things together. And over time, I went to school. I have a doctorate in ministry, and that was fun. There's lots of good stories there, but this ain't church, so I'm not going to tell those. But eventually, I ended up preaching in this small church outside of New Orleans. The only time in my life I've lived outside of the state of Texas was 3 years after Hurricane Katrina. For 3 years, starting just a couple months after Hurricane Katrina. Craziest idea I ever had in my life. In fact, I started to wonder if maybe I was that crazy lady who shouldn't be a starship captain. So while I'm at this church, I'm there. I'd only been there maybe a couple months, and I had just finished teaching this class. Let me tell you, folks, this class was amazing. I mean, lives were changed. In those minutes, those precious seconds, I saw the light bulbs going off around the room. And it was because we had a short in the electrical system, but still, there was really great stuff that was happening everywhere I looked. And people were just, they were just almost fainting because these words were so touching. So I finished up my class, and I'm putting my stuff away, because I got stuff. I got books, and I got pieces of paper with scribbles on them that people think are notes, but they're doodles. And I'm putting them away. And I'm just sitting there congratulating myself. Man, that was good stuff. And, so let me step aside here. Not too long ago, I was driving to my grandparents' house with my wife and our 3 boys. And we have always had a rule, my wife and I, that we are going to appreciate whatever stage our boys are at. That way, I don't have to feel guilty whenever we leave that stage and go to the next one. Because I appreciate it. So I don't have to feel bad one bit saying I don't miss diaper bags. I don't miss the crying babies. Now, I have great memories of my boys when they were little, and now my 13-year-old he's almost as tall as me. We're going to have words when that day comes that he gets too big for my britches. But we're now in the stage when, as we drive down the road, lots of times they're reading a book. They're quiet. It's amazing. So my wife and I, we're riding along in the van, and the boys are in the back seat, and everything's quiet. And she looks up and she says, "I can't remember if I put the coconut in the coconut cream pie." Now, my wife is brilliant. Don't mistake anything, especially since this fella's got a camera going and she may find out. I want to say clearly, my wife is smarter than all of us. She's brilliant. She's a speech therapist. She's a bookkeeper. And somehow she runs, she's the CEO of the Wells household as well, and keeps four boys in line every day. But she says, I can't remember if I put the coconut in the coconut cream pie. So I tried to give one of my brilliant responses. I said, oh no. And we went back to driving. And a few seconds later I said, babe, you ever hear how they say that when you observe something, you change it? Like, that the act of observing something actually changes the thing you're observing. I may have heard something about that. And so I launch into another, much like that class that I taught at that small little church, I launched into a few minutes of amazing education. It was astounding. I talked about how they've seen that light can exist as a wave and a particle, but not both. And once you observe it and measure it as one, it becomes that one. How does that work? I have no idea. I talked about quantum theory and spooky action at a distance. This is great stuff. You can't just get this anywhere. You certainly can't get it in a hayfield in Central Texas. I mean, you can now. But I finished this great story, this tale, this lesson, this education. And my wife says, I'm still just trying to remember if I put coconut in the coconut cream pie. So much like that, in that act of feeling observed, and I knew that in this day, this teaching, this class, I was the light particle, or the light that was being observed, and I was about to become either particle or wave, but I didn't know somebody was coming, but I knew somebody was coming. And so I'm putting my stuff away, and I look up, and here he comes. It's unmistakable. I mean, he had the stooped over posture. He had the skin that showed the leathery wrinkles of hard-earned work for decades and decades. He had the clothes that didn't fit so well anymore, but when he probably first bought them before I was born, they probably fit really well. And somehow he was shuffling slowly and catapulting forward at an extreme rate of speed, right toward me. And I said to myself, because I'm a doctor, this guy's just barely hanging on. He's a feeble guy. Gonna need to use the kid gloves with him. I was wrong. The first words I heard from this man, his name is Will Powers. First words this man ever spoke to me was, do you know what your problem is? Now remember, I grew up on the ranch with my grandfather, so unlike many young preachers who would in that moment have had one of two choices, either cower in fear or get defensive and really just ruin everything, I took another route. I said, I have a suspicion that I'm about to find out what my one problem is, but I'm curious as how you've already narrowed it down to one. And I don't know if he couldn't hear me or if he didn't care, and I suspect it's that he didn't care. He launches into a story telling me exactly what was wrong with me. And that began a relationship that, to this day, researchers, scientists, philosophers, children study this case study of how could these two people be friends. I mean, this is the same guy that about a year later, he comes up to me after one of my sermons and says, I've heard over 10,000 sermons in my life. And last week's was pretty good. But this one was the worst sermon that I've ever heard and that you've ever preached. And I said, that can't possibly be right. Because you've slept through at least 6 of my sermons, and any one of them could have been worse than this one. But here's what I found out in my time really building a friendship with this man that was himself a mixture of so many different things. It's that we all have a story that we're telling at every moment. And those stories determine what we see. I told a story about a feeble old man coming toward me, and I saw that. And it couldn't have been further from the truth. My wife told a story about coconut cream pie, and she couldn't see the brilliance of quantum physics that I was laying out for her. My grandfather told a story about getting an education and moving on, and he was right. But I'll never leave that ranch completely. Thank you.